Today on BRStv Investigates, we've got the secret to mastering the G5 Radion XR15 Pro for spread, spectrum, and par. And if you follow the recommendations I'm about to share from our extensive Investigates tests, there's no doubt that you too can start to master your own reef tanks lighting forever. Hi, I'm Randy with this Friday's BRStv Investigates, where we experiment on our own tanks so you don't have to experiment on yours. And today we help you master the three major components of spread, spectrum, and par for your G5 Radion XR15 Pro, giving you the confidence you need to know that you've got your tank's lighting needs done right once and for all. Today we'll use our data from the BRS testing lab to provide you with direct BRS recommendations for mastering light spread, meaning a combination of choosing the right amount of XR15s, how high to mount them, and how to optimally space multiple pros over your tank, mastering light spectrum and using the right amount of spectrum ingredients from the XR15 that keep you and your corals happy, and mastering the XR15 Pro par output, achieving those LPS and SPS dominated tanks, but more importantly, the settings that you'll need to get you there. This is our fourth G5 Radion that we've tested so far, and through all of our hands-on testing experience that we've gained between the Radion Pro and the Radion Blue models, we suggest the Radion Blue models for those reefers looking to squeeze the absolute most par output available through an efficient use of each individual LED by running them at 100%, which also creates a bluer looking tank. However, for those pro reefers with experience in adjusting spectrum output and understand what those spectrum sliders are doing within the tank, then this pro level tool for max adjustment and fine tuning to your desires is definitely the choice for you. So if you're looking for an LED lighting option that's capable of achieving any tank type you desire at a third less cost and half the footprint of other larger models, full flexibility over spectrum, coupled with one of the smoothest control platforms for mobile and tablet control out there, then you better stick around to see how the G5 Radion XR15 Pro can be the right tool for you and your tank coming up next. That first secret to mastering the Radion XR15 Pro is to start by mastering spread, which is a crucial step to ensuring that you place your corals intelligently and optimize your tank in such a way that you maximize the optimal par throughout the entire tank, top to bottom and edge to edge, allowing you to wrap your corals in an even blanket of par with minimal amounts of intense hot spots, cold spots, or shadows of super low par. That all begins by first figuring out how many XR15 Pros we'll need to allow us to accomplish those goals. And this recommendation comes from the data you're about to see, where we have two common tank types in mind: a tank full of brilliantly colored hammers, torches, acans, leathers, or Zoa polyp gardens, or that iconic SPS dominated tank with large, mature branching colonies in all colors of the rainbow packed from edge to edge of the tank. If that first LPS tank type is what you dream of, we recommend using a single XR15 Pro in a 24-inch cube tank similar to our 60-gallon system, while in a tank twice that size like our 4-foot 120-gallon system, double that recommendation and use two XR15s for the same tank type. And if you have hopes and aspirations of growing out a tank jam-packed with SPS, you'll see why we believe the larger XR30 Pro is the right tool for achieving that in the same 60-gallon 2-foot cube. However, in that same breath, today you'll see why 4 XR15 Pros is our tool of choice for reaching those SPS goals in the larger 4-foot tank, not only saving you a third of the cost over the XR30s to do the same job, but also more spread and better performance overall in that 4-foot by 2-foot area. That second aspect to mastering light spread using the XR15 Pro is probably the most important piece of information to know about any light source we put over our tanks, and that is how high to properly mount them in order to get the maximum optimal spread possible from a single light source. The information we gather in this mounting height test will allow us to identify the light spread capabilities where directly underneath the light intense hotspots might occur, or towards the edges and outer edges of the tank there might be more par drop off and cold spots. To test for the optimal mounting height, we start with the light mounted at 6 inches above the surface of the water over this 60-gallon test tank, and then measure 36 different points of par in a grid at 6 inches from the top edge of the tank. We then raise the light higher, 1 inch at a time, testing the same 36 par measurements along the way until we find an optimal mounting height where we've reduced any hotspot in the center directly under the light, while also increasing the PAR in the outer edges of the tank, but we stop the test when we see 15% or more of light efficiency lost to spill in the surrounding area. At 6 inches, we're already seeing phenomenal performance with only 282 PAR difference between the 454 center compared to the 172 outer ring. Already, this is a pretty well-distributed light source that averages 259 PAR across the entire 2-foot area and better performance than we've seen from many other LEDs. Although the XR15 Pro demonstrates a solid distribution spread performance already, we are testing to find that optimal mounting height that reduces the center hotspot and increases the outer ring. So we move it up to another inch at 7 inches off the water, which reduces the center down to 368 and improves the outer PAR ring to 193. At this height, our total average PAR has only decreased by 4% to 248, so we still have room within our 15% threshold to improve, and as such, we raise the light to 8 inches. Now with the light mounted at 8 inches off the water, we find even better performance in an even spread of PAR, with the center now at 308 and the outer ring at 201. Certainly with points in the center averaging only 150 to 200 PAR higher than points on the outside, this type of even spread performance is at the top of other lights we've tested. However, with only a 10% loss of efficiency, we raised the light by 1 more inch to 9 inches to see if we could even out that spread even further, and we found exactly that. With the XR15 Pro mounted at 9 inches, it has a 268 average center and a 201 outer ring. We found an optimal BRS spread performance where almost every one of all 36 data points are within 150 PAR of each other, with even some of the center points within less than 20 PAR of the edges. The most notable point about this LED light is that it actually performs better at a 6-inch mounting height than any other LED light we've tested so far, which is becoming a common theme here, but even remarkably better at our BRS recommended 9-inch mounting height. Even more satisfying is that we've found that all of the G5 Radion light fixtures' optimal mounting heights are exactly the same mounting height as the RMS tank mount kits designed for them, which again hasn't been the case with any other lights. Even spread and usable PAR levels at lower mounting heights is exactly where the XR15 shines above the rest. The final aspect of mastering the light spread of the XR15 Pro before we move on to spectrum and PAR is by properly spacing multiple light modules over a larger tank, where we can smartly harness the intersecting light points and naturally occurring higher PAR in those areas in order to reduce hotspot and cold spots across the entire length of the tank and achieve the most even blanket of light possible. To do that, we strategically space the lights across our 4-foot test tank, moving them apart inch by inch until we find a sweet spot where the average PAR in the outer edges is at or above 75% of the average PAR in the center. We approach our light spacing test from 2 angles. First is from our recommendation for using 2 Gen5 XR15 Pros for a 4-foot tank filled with medium to lower light demand corals like Euphyllia, acans, Duncans, Zoa Gardens, and Pallies. We start by mounting 2 XR15s at the BRS recommended 9 inches off the top of the water, evenly spaced across the 48-inch tank at 16 inches on center from the left and right edges of the tank, then take a grid of 66 PAR data points at 12 inches deep in the tank where the light intersection points are the most prominent. At that 16-inch light spacing, we see that the average PAR of 168 in the outer edges is only within 57% of the 293 PAR center, so it's obvious that we will need to space the modules out further apart to get closer to our 75% goal. With that, we move the XR15s apart 1 inch further to 15 inches on center, where we now see a 65% spread performance from the outer edges now at 182 and the center lowering to 278, but with room to improve, we space them further apart again to 14 inches on center. At 14 inches from the left and right edges of the tank, we come very close to our goal, yet slightly under at 74%, so we move the 2 XR15s apart one more time to 13 inches on center and find not only are the outer edges within 85% of the center PAR average, but the spread performance is so evenly distributed that there's less than a 50 PAR difference between the 242 average PAR in the middle of the tank to the 205 average PAR to the left and right edges, making 13 inches on center for 2 XR15 Gen5 Pros our BRS recommended spacing for an LPS and softy 4-foot 120-gallon tank. The second angle we test light spacing is to master the spread of XR15 Pros using 4 modules over the same 4-foot tank with the goal of filling the tank with a plethora of branching acropora, sticks, and other SPS-dominated coral types. Again, we mount our 4 XR15s at the recommended 9 inches and spaced centered at 9.6-inch increments, which divides our 48-inch tank evenly. Then we measure the same 66 par data points at 12 inches deep in the tank to find that sweet spot spacing when we've reached or surpassed that 75% goal. With the light spaced evenly on center at 9.6-inch increments, there's already a solid performance here in even spread across the entire tank, with a 511 par average in the center and 367 average between the left and right edges, which nearly reaches our goal, coming in at 72%. For those of you looking for an easy solution to properly spacing your lights out of the box, this is the best performance we've seen using 4 light modules evenly spaced, and certainly wouldn't need much tweaking after that. However, our goal is to find that optimal light spacing sweet spot. We continue to test with multiple variations of moving the outer XR15 Pros closer to the edges, along with spacing the middle 2 modules further apart from each other, until we landed on our BRS recommended spacing of 2 XR15s centered at 8 by 17.2 inches from the left edge of the tank, and a mirror image of that for the right side at 17.2 and 8 inches from the extreme right edge of the tank. At an average par in the outer edges coming within 84% of the center average par of 452, a spread this even and smooth is exactly what it means to master spread using the Gen5 XR15 Pro, and now we're ready to use this spread and distribution data for the next 2 components of today's test, mastering spectrum and mastering par. So we now know how many Radion XR15s we need to get the job done, how high to mount one for optimal spread performance, and how to space multiple modules to optimize their distribution across a larger area, meaning we've got this spread mastered for these lights. But now it's time to start thinking about spectrum and the specific needs of the corals that we have in the tank, both for their metabolic and energy needs, as well as ideal coloration so the tank is awesome to look at. Within that, we look at 3 things to mastering spectrum. First is, what does the XR15 Pro offer for individual LED channels and spectral color peaks? Or basically, what's the list of ingredients that the Radion offers, and what spectrum blend can we expect to make from them? Second, we use those channels or ingredients to actually create a spectrum blend that meets our goals for coral growth and aesthetic appeal. Then third, we put the XR15 Pro to the test and see how smooth and evenly the lenses and optics take all of those color channel ingredients and blend them together into one homogeneous mix inside the tank. So let's dive right into the first part of mastering spectrum and check out what the Radion Pro has to offer for spectrum ingredients, where there are 8 controllable channels to choose from, with a UV channel that peaks at 404, violet channel at 424, which is close to a T5 actinic bulb, royal blue channel with a peak at 446, where we find the most coral fluorescence, a blue channel at 475. The green channel LEDs have a hump at 515, while the red channel spikes at 657. Finally, there's a warm white channel that has taken the emphasis off of the blue peak and gets its warm white look from heavier yellow, orange, and red, while the cool white channel keeps the peak in the blue at 442, with more of its white coming from higher ratios of green and yellow. So those are the ingredients that we have to work with. The next part of mastering spectrum is to tune those channels into a spectrum blend that balances what the Radion XR15 Pro has to offer through efficient use of the LEDs, while also targeting a wide blue spectrum approach for optimal coral health, adding in whites for our eye, and making our best judgment on the remaining green, red, and other channels. Once we have a tuned spectrum blend that meets these goals, we compare it against a standard broad blue spectrum peak based on the most successful light source of all time, the ATI Blue Plus T5 bulb. After adjusting the 8 channels with these goals in mind and testing with our eye and spectrometer, we developed the following settings that we believe not only look good, but also accomplish a wide blue spectrum as possible, with the UV, violet, royal blue, and blue channels each set to 100%, greens and reds at 15%, warm white at 20%, and cool white set to 50% to balance out the tank. For comparison, here's what that BRS recommended spectrum looks like compared to the same tank lit with just ATI T5 Blue Plus bulbs, where we can see that we've balanced out that Windex blue look of the T5s and how that blue peak at 445 draws out even more fluorescence in some of those orange, greens, and yellows. Looking at the spectrum charts for both our tune spectrum and the blue plus bulb, the Radion XR15 Pro is a little narrower in that blue spectrum on either side of the 446 peak. However, the net result here is that some corals will fluoresce slightly different under the Radion versus the blue plus bulb. All in all, I'd say that our primary goal of providing spectrum representation throughout that 400 to 500 range for coral growth and health has been met, as well as our goal of balancing out that heavy blue look, which leads us to the final aspect of mastering spectrum before we move into mastering PAR, and that is to look at how the Radion light design and related lenses blend all of these peaks in our dynamic spectrum blending test. For this test, we placed the G5 XR15 Pro over our 60-gallon test tank filled with water, turn on a power head to create surface agitation and replicate a reef tank environment, then take 10 spectrometer readings underneath the tank where signs of even spectrum blending will be the most obvious. Cycling through those 10 data points, although the blending performance isn't as perfect as the gold standard T5, the slight shifts around 470 and 480 range is really the most notable call out for this test, and even though they are noticeable, this is a major improvement over previous Gen 4 options and better than many of the LEDs we've tested. Now we come to that third component of mastering lighting using our G5 Radion XR15 Pro, and that is to take what we've learned from both spectrum and spread and harness that data to tune the light to perfection for two tank type goals. Either a tank full of jaw-dropping hammers, torches, acans, mushrooms, and polyps, or a tank packed with rainbow-colored sticks, branching acros, and higher PAR demand SPS. To master PAR for these two tank types, we first need to identify the PAR goals for each tank. So if you want the advanced version on how to master PAR with these goals in mind and how we reach them, watch for a link for Ryan's Mastering PAR video in the description, but for the shortened version and the purpose of today's XR15 test, we try to reach 75 to 150 PAR in as much of the tank as possible for LPS softies and polyps, while for those SPS dominated systems, that PAR goal is a little higher at 200 to 350. Let's master those LPS tanks first by looking at our 60 and 120 gallon test tanks, where we mount the recommended number of XR15s at the optimal 9-inch mounting height and optimal spacing, set them to our recommended tune spectrum ratio, adjust the overall point intensity, then we take grids of PAR measurements at 6, 12, and 18 inches deep in the tank, looking for 70% or more of all points from top to bottom and side to side within those 75 to 150 PAR ranges. For our 2 foot by 2 foot 60 gallon cube and using the recommended spectrum blend, again UV, violet, royal blue, and blue channels set to 100%, green and red to 15, warm white to 20, and cool whites to 50, we turned down the overall point intensity to 70%, where we found a phenomenal performance of 98 out of 108 data points, or 91% of the entire tank optimized for our LPS tank type. This is the definition of mastering PAR using this light for this size of tank and tank theme type. Following the same 9-inch mounting height with two XR15 spaced at 13 inches on center over our 120 gallon test tank, we set our spectrum ratio to a 60% overall intensity, and again measured a stellar performance of 86% or 170 out of 198 testing points in that PAR sweet spot range of 75 to 150. I just don't think this light could perform any better than what we're seeing here. Now we attempt to master that PAR of SPS dominated systems using XR15 Pros, where, as I mentioned earlier about choosing the right tool for the right job, a single G5 Pro in our 2 foot by 2 foot cube tank is not the tool that we would choose. So to accomplish this high PAR demand tank type in a 60 gallon cube, we've already identified that the XR15's larger brother, the XR30 Pro, is the right option in a BRStv Investigates video I'll leave for you in the description. However, for our 120 gallon test tank using the recommended 4 XR15s, we found the XR15 to be the better tool at achieving an SPS-dominated system over 3 of the larger XR30s from that same BRStv Investigates test, and I'm about to show you why. Again, we've mounted 4 XR15s over our 4-foot tank at the recommended 9 inches off the water, and at this recommended spacing that you see here, Then, with our custom spectrum mix set to an overall point intensity of 85%, we tested 168 out of 198 data points from the top, middle, and bottom of the tank that hit exactly at or between our 200 to 350 par goal. That means for a third less cost of using 3 XR30s, you can use 4 XR15 Pros to gain 5% more points throughout this entire 4-foot tank within those target par ranges for SPS corals, and almost a 10% gain in even light spread across all 48 inches. That means more spread, better performance, and lower cost, giving the G5 Radion XR15s that value trifecta, and begins to answer that question of who is the G5 XR15 Pro for and where does it excel the most. Looking at the data, this Radion Pro is perfect for both LPS and SPS tanks, specifically for those who want to mount the light as close as 9 inches above the surface of the water. It's definitely not the cheapest option to achieve the tank goals that we test for, but for those willing to jump in and want a light that has one of the widest spreads that we've tested from one of the smallest form factors, full control over the spectrum and single slider for dialing in the optimal par, super easy mounting system, and all with phone or tablet-based app control that takes minutes to set up, I think this is the right light for you. The only question we're left with is, if you don't have a 60 or 120 gallon tank just like ours, but you want to use our BRS recommended mounting height and spectrum ratio mix, how do you test the par correctly for your own tank and trust that you've mastered your own XR15s? The answer you're looking for is right here in Ryan's video on how to use a par meter the right way.